All right. So my name is Drew, and I'm going to be doing the economic impact of war on crude oil. And not to brown this too much, but I want to thank Dr. Ladd and my group for allowing me to do this on such late notice. It really helps me out. Um, anyway, so how does war impact oil prices? So as already referenced in the video we showed you from the Wall Street Journal, Russia's invasion of Ukraine provides a great example for us to look at how the recent invasion has not only affected oil prices in both Ukraine and Russia, but worldwide as well. So just to give you a little bit of a timeline, 2 weeks before Russia invaded Ukraine, worldwide oil prices were already approaching $100 a barrel, which is around 42 gallons. So just to give you a little bit more of a reference point, I will be using US oil prices because I think they provide a good example. Um, and because the US is so reliant on international crude oil exports, as many countries are, the US also uses the most oil at around 100 million barrels a day. So the US has had to do its best to be competitive in the oil market. So I'll be using them as a reference. Anyway, with oil prices steadily rising over the last couple of years, averages have normally floated around $60 to $75 a barrel over the last 10 to 15 years, as you can see from the graph here. But just recently, as you can see in 2022, averages have hit the $100 a barrel mark. So even with those averages and steady increases in mind, the invasion of Russia into Ukraine has definitely affected oil prices, and here's how. So on February 24th, 2022, Russia officially launches its military invasion. Keep in mind that $100 a barrel mark that took around 2 years to hit from the $75 average. So now with the invasion, prices have since skyrocketed to over $110 to $115 a barrel in a very short period of time, which is around 3 weeks, which means that it has taken what has taken around 10 years happened in the last two, with an increase of around 10 to 15% occurring in the last month even. So now we all know supply and demand from econ, and with both Russia and Ukraine using more oil and transport for war goods, as well as civilians in Ukraine using transport to flee the country, overall supply of oil is decreasing, making demand obviously increase. However, what makes the situation even worse is the fact that Russia is the second largest crude oil export, only after Saudi Arabia. Now, clearly, this is going to have international repercussions and is responsible for a large portion of the crude oil price increase, which is correct. But to make matters even worse is the decision by many countries to ban oil exports from Russia, which is their opinion, but it has to happen, which the US has also chosen to do, by the way. Now this only puts more pressure on the crude oil supply, because not only is Russia hoarding more, some countries aren't even allowing Russia to export. So although black market groups are buying up Russia to sell then to the US, so it doesn't make it look like the US is buying oil from Russia, these bans do overall have a large result in large international oil price hikes. And at this point, I'm sure some of you are asking where OPEC comes into play. And just to give you a little bit of background on OPEC, OPEC is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, with the countries being Algeria, Angola, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Libya, Nigeria, Republic of the Congo, Saudi Arabia, which is the big one that exports around 7.24 million barrels a day, the United Arab Emirates, and Venezuela. So as you can see from the graph here, OPEC is responsible for around 80% of the world's oil reserves. So with both the US and Russia not being a part of OPEC, which is a big deal because the US has recently decided to deny Russian oil imports, as I explained earlier, this means that the US is now solely reliant on OPEC and the countries within to take care of that $100 million a barrel need. So OPEC has realized this and has actually just told the EU officials just yesterday, or I guess 2 days ago, that the current global oil crisis is beyond the group's control. As stated in Bloomberg, Russian oil supply losses stemming from current future sanctions or a boycott by customers could potentially exceed 7 million barrels a day. And that would be far beyond OPEC's responsibility to replace, EU Energy Commissioner Kadri Simpson said. So these price hikes have also bolstered diesel, which have added to inflationary pressures and cost of living crisis, and has hit many customers, which were discussed previously in the presentation. So obviously, with Russia no longer being able to export to a large number of countries, namely the US, global supply has decreased. OPEC has had no choice but to increase prices and will likely to continue to increase them until some sort of resolution in Ukraine occurs. So even with just two countries going to war, even with it being from a very large provider of oil in Russia, crude oil prices have increased internationally 10 to 15%. And although prices could, possibly increase even more, the strain on the system even right now is huge. So hopefully not. But if the unthinkable were to happen and the EU has talks with Ukraine and Putin, allows Ukrainians to shift into their countries, and Ukraine is, given away like this Daneland was to Hitler in Munich. And let's say, as most dictators do, Putin isn't appeased and wants more control and decides to go to war with the world with his massive nuclear arsenal. What would that do to oil prices? Historically, oil prices have been especially high, especially in the initial years of war. But what tends to happen is prices subsequently decline after those initial years because of those higher prices. So the higher prices reduce demand and therefore decrease prices. So normal people, will just have to wait it out. So if the world, were to go to war, prices would most likely skyrocket very quickly, especially in those first couple months and years, because it would be incredibly valuable as Russia would hoard its entire supply, cause havoc on the crude oil market, and make everyone that isn't part of, their military hoard, making it extremely valuable. So even after those initial years, prices would come down because of demand, and hopefully Putin would get taken out and we all go back to paying, $2.50 a gallon instead of $5+. So overall, crude oil is very susceptible and sensitive to war, and the economic impact of war on oil, especially involving countries with a large supply of oil, makes oil prices even more volatile and hurts the average consumer's pockets when they go to the gas pump. So here's Lucas to go over the economic impact of war and national debt.